As work is finally concluding on my RTS book, it meant taking a deeper look at kind of the state of the market, and especially the trends over the 2010s, with really trying to position it as to be the next big esport along the lines of MOBAs, fighting, shooting, and all that. But for today's critical thought, this will probably be the latest topic to get me in a lot of trouble. We're going to talk about why the second worst thing that has happened to the game industry has been the pursuit of esports. If you want to know what the number one thing is, well, I'm not going to tell you that in the same video. I gotta have some element of suspense. When we talk about esports as kind of its own place in the game industry and how it's evolved, we can look at kind of distinct periods of its interaction and its impact on game design. When we talk about kind of the early, or kind of what we look at what will become the state of esports, we can talk about the early to mid 90s, the rise of games like Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat, and of course StarCraft. At this point in time, there really wasn't an esports scene prior. Everyone thought that esports or competitive gaming was going to be more like score-based challenges, Twin Galaxies, The Wizard, that kind of thing. But the 90s started to begin this push for big money. And again, kind of this big awareness. The most famous, of course, being South Korea with the World Cyber Games, and kind of elevating StarCraft at the time to being a major sporting event there. This, of course, would then fall into the early 2000s, and of course to StarCraft 2. But the 2000s brought with it this kind of slow growth of esports outside of just StarCraft. This is when we began to see the first inklings of this chase for esports money from the likes of course, EA, Microsoft, and others. And while it wasn't really able to capitalize on it just yet, we were beginning to see more and more publishers and developers try to make their games more approving or popular for the esports side. And again, we saw this from the local level with people playing the likes of Halo, from even playing stuff like Return to Castle Wolfenstein's multiplayer and so on. And of course, this is when Counter-Strike started to slowly but surely take over its own respective space. But it wasn't until the 2010s, maybe even a little bit earlier than that, that with the rise of live service and games as a service, that the two started to kind of become combined in terms of their appeal and what they were trying to impact on the market itself. This is when we really began to see the likes of League of Legends start presenting not only this kind of formal tournament model for its esports, but that the game itself was being designed around that in play. And that represents one of the first major changes to how esports and the rest of the game industry kind of evolved. Previously, video games were not designed anywhere with the esports mentality in mind. It was considered more like a secondary thought, or maybe it's nice to have, but no one was out and around chasing or trying to build their game at that same level. And the games that were kind of taken over by esports, Counter-Strike, Smash, Mortal Kombat, StarCraft, and so on, again, the developers were not building these games in mind with building them as a competitive platform first. They were building them as great products with both single and multiplayer components. A really big example of this is, of course, Smash Bros. That it has been proven definitively at this point that Nintendo does not in any way, shape, or form care about the esports side of the Smash fandom. And again, we have seen many of these tournaments being taken down by Nintendo as further proof of it. But the 2010s brought with it this idea of really trying to combine the live service mentality with the rise of esports, making a forever game that competitive fans and players can just keep playing again and again. We keep supporting with more seasons, more tournaments, more sponsors, money for everyone. And this is where we began to see the likes of Command & Conquer 4 go that we've talked about previously. This idea of making a game that is strictly for the competitive audience. And during the 2010s, we saw from the indie space, and even kind of like the AA side, a lot of studios and games being made by former esports players, esports coaches, trying to build the next big game. And they've succeeded or failed to varying degrees. But you see, this is when we began to see this kind of limit to esports. And in order to understand this, you need to understand kind of how the mentality for what is an esport and esport playing has shifted from the 2000s to the 2010s to where it is today. During the 2000s, esports were considered this thing. No one really knew what to do with it. They heard of StarCraft, they heard of Street Fighter, but it wasn't really something that a lot of people outside the hardcore circles was really taking seriously. There was, of course, EVO tournaments going on, but outside of some random clip or, the greatest EVO moments, a lot of people who weren't already following that weren't really paying attention. In the 2010s, the kind of push for esports in the mainstream began in a huge way. We saw the rise of the idea of being an esports caster. People like Day9 being probably one of the biggest examples of this. This idea of trying to mainstream esports, turn it into almost akin to watching football, soccer, tennis, whatever. And people were really trying to make this work. This was this period where people were trying to make esports kind of be almost in a symbiotic relationship with the rest of the game industry. And I've even made videos about this, I think, way back, or even posts on it. That the idea was, you support a game as an esport, thereby it keeps renewed interest, so people keep playing the game and spending money on it, so that the developers get more money to create new content, which is then bought by the fans and the hardcore players, and these games can just keep being developed again and again until the sun eventually dies. And this was not lost on a lot of developers and publishers. Again, for those of you watching this, if I were to ask you, gun to your head, name me 5 esports-worthy games, you will probably mention Fortnite, Counter-Strike, Valorant, StarCraft, and maybe you'll throw some other smaller game like an Apex Legends, a Dead by Daylight, and again, there's always these other games out there. But for every one of the games that you've mentioned, there were at least a few dozen games of pick any genre, from Smash Bros. Likes, Battle Royale clones, MOBA clones, Counter-Strike clones, you name it, that have came, went, and no one even knows that they've existed anymore, outside of the people who have already or still love those games and wish for them to come back. And herein lies kind of the first kind of shot fired for this video. The assumption that esports would greatly benefit a studio and the game developers has been largely, I think, overestimated. What has happened is that instead of this being a relationship where the game grows along with the esport grows along with the game, esports has kind of become its own separate entity, separate from the rest of the game, the rest of the consumer base, and the rest of the market itself. And we can see this again and again with pick any popular esport game, especially as a fun challenge. Pick one that has achievements. And look at the churn rates for these achievements. Now, some people say, well, it'll be achievements like, win 100 matches, win 50 matches. We see massive churn just by finish tutorial, play one ranked match, win one ranked match, even get ranked in these games can be maybe 20 to 30% or less of the player base of these platforms. And it creates this kind of weird dichotomy of what it means to play an esport game and what it means to grow them. And like I said, one of the biggest changes that happened from the 2000s to the 2010s was that instead of making a game and then kind of the esport community deciding to adopt it or not, a lot of developers chase that. They wanted to make games specifically for it to be an esport. And this meant cutting out a lot of the content and elements that people would have liked from the single player side. Aspects like full-on customization, unique story or mission-driven gameplay, and even just in some cases, just having single-player content in general. And the push to make games esports worthy or esports popular led to a lot of designs and a lot of games feeling very homogenized in the market. A great example of this would be mainstream real-time strategy games. Can you name any 5 popular real-time strategy games being currently played today? And no, Age of Empires does not count on that list. We don't have the time to wait for that. The real-time strategy genre itself ran to this case where a lot of the people who wanted the more competitive-driven aspects of it went straight to the MOBA scene with LoL, Dota, Heroes of the Storm for its brief period, and so on. But mainstream RTS just kind of came and went in a lot of cases. The most exciting RTS news as of June 2024 was the announcement of the game Battle Aces, but even that looks very similar to the faster unit-focused play of a MOBA-style game. And when we look at trying to make these games esports popular, in a lot of cases, it leads to these games just being worse games for everyone else included. People have been complaining and arguing about the changes to Overwatch 2 compared to Overwatch 1, trying to once again chase after this esports side. And when we talk about chasing the esports angle, we mean making games that are designed to be very symmetrical, trying to remove all the spikiness or plays that don't kind of fit outside of the play of the game. And it's time for another very unsettling truth. Esports players do not care about anyone else other than esports players. And we can see this again with how esports are set up. The line or the spectrum of players from bad to okay to competent to esport level is very massive. And a lot of this is built into the rankings and ELO or LO systems. Does someone who has played a fighting game for 10,000 hours want to load up the game and play with someone who just started playing it for a free weekend? Probably not. And likewise, that free player doesn't want to start their first match with someone who is ranked, in the top 500 players in the world at this game. But you see, this is the problem with the chase of the esport market, that it creates a very mixed consumer base, and one that as a developer, you can't chase them both at the same time. It's fundamentally not possible. Consumers want brand new content. They want new spikiness. They want something that is legitimately different than what they played 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, 1 month, 1 year, doesn't matter. The esports side, they have proven time and time again that they don't want those elements at the professional or tournament level. They don't want to play a game where characters can have customization, that a special move by one character with a certain costume is stronger than the customization of another character. A lot of these games kind of forbid or prevent any kind of personalization when it comes to tournament play. And again, it works for the competitive scene, but this is the kind of stuff that drives the general market, that drives that interest. And it's not just interest in watching. Because again, this is what people will argue, that people watch games like League of Legends, like Mortal Kombat, StarCraft, and whatnot. But they're not staying around to play them. And that means when it comes to developing content, that the content that comes out for these games is very kind of laser focused. Like, they're trying to make more personalization options, more stuff like that for, let's say, a game like Mortal Kombat. But the competitive side just outright turns that off, and it's only going to be interested in for kind of casual and core play. But Are they still playing this game after they finish the story mode? Are they still playing these games versus every day? And like I said, it's created this dichotomy of what it means to make a game that's trying to appeal to both sides at the same time. And what we've seen is that trying to chase specifically the esports angle leads to these games with very few or very short shelf lives. Even the ones that do get picked up by the likes of Evo that become a major esports, it doesn't lead to these games having continued consumer growth. At some point, everyone who's played this game or wanted to play this game has already played it. And for the vast majority of them, they're not going to play it anymore. And we can again see this with the achievement rates and the churn rates for these games. When 60% of the player base doesn't even bother starting one ranked play, that's not a healthy game to then decide, let's make a sequel and try to do things bigger and better. And for developers and studios that have tried to chase the esports professional scene, they're finding that people don't want to play an esports game. It's fine to watch here and there, but the audience of people who are going to play a game like a Skullgirls, like Mortal Kombat 1, Street Fighter 6, and keep playing it and supporting it at that level is far smaller than I think everyone wants to really admit. And so no matter how much money gets thrown at major teams, major sponsorships, major players in the space, none of that really kind of gets its way back to the developers. Yes, you can have a game that is on the grand stage at EVO. Does that help the developers at all after that game's been out for 3, 5, 10, even longer than that years? It doesn't. And it's why this kind of whole myth of esports becoming as big or standing directly side by side with developers has kind of been shattered. Because if the developer wants to do something that makes their game more appealing to people who aren't in the esports scene, esports players will probably just cut it out or ignore it. But then if you are trying to just keep building a game as an esport, people who've come from the outside, they're not going to want to play that. Who wants to start a game that's been out for 5, 7, 10 years, where people have hundreds if not thousands of hours of play, and you're going to start brand new with no idea how to play it? And that's another interesting point. A lot of these games are notoriously bad when it comes to the new player's perspective and early onboarding. Just try learning Dead by Daylight today and only using the in-game tutorial and not watching any guide videos, and see how much fun you're going to have there. And again, it gets at this point that general or consumer play of the game and competitive and esports play of a game are very much just two separate worlds at this point. And only one of them, unfortunately for the other side, matters to the developer. And that's the consumer side. Because again, doesn't matter how long you support a game for, if you're just still putting out more and more content, more skins, gun mods, maps, and people aren't paying for that or they're not interested other than your ever dwindling or smaller hardcore fan base, that game is not going to survive long. And this is the point where someone's going to bring up, well, what about stuff like Call of Duty? Again, League of Legends, Valorant, Rainbow Six Siege, already established games. And the point is, once you become established, that bubble has completely burst for everyone else. Again, name me another competitive first-person shooter that has come out in the last 3 to 4 years that is as stable or is as growing as the likes of Paladins, or was it a Smite as another one? I think that's more like of a third or first-person MOBA style. For every game that succeeds, there are countless others that haven't. And developers are still trying to chase this idea or trying to court the esports scene, thinking that it will bring everyone else along with them. But what we've seen time and time again, that it doesn't work that way. That if your game is not resonating with the mainstream market, the mainstream audience first, it doesn't matter how many leagues you want to have, how many sponsors are lined up, how many tournaments and cups and finals you want to throw at it, people are not going to be interested in it. And when you listen to esports players in terms of what they want at that competitive level, a lot of it just leads to these matches being boring. Why haven't we seen someone make a really solid take on Team Fortress with as many wacky and unique and original characters and classes and tactics? Because everyone wanted to make their game more esports popular, which meant, again, kind of sanding down the edges of their design. That you can't have a character be weird and different, doesn't play like anyone else, because that can mess with the competitive level. And what about banning these characters and banning stages? And again, there is a fundamental difference between tournaments and kind of tournament creators establishing hard rules for what they want out of that game, and the developer making their game to kind of squeeze into that box for tournament players. So, to kind of wrap things up for our video for today, when we look at the games and the genres that have tried to chase the most after these respective fan bases, they are some of the ones that have kind of the smallest kind of fingerprints in the game market today when it comes to the mainstream. You can rant and rave about the likes of Street Fighter 6, MK1, or what was it, 12 or 13, I forget which one we're up to. But a lot of people, once they check out that story mode, once they play through just one time, they're never touching versus, they're never touching rank play, they could care less about ever participating in a tournament, or in some cases even just following those tournaments. And you can even see this with games that have such like potential for that. Dragon Ball FighterZ, and they just announced I think a new Dragon Ball Budokai game. Dragon Ball is a very popular franchise. Duh. And it is kind of set up to be like the perfect mainstream fighting game, with characters launching Kamehamehas that cause 10 different styles of seizures in full 4K HD. But even Dragon Ball has had this trouble in terms of capturing the market outside that esports fan. Dragon Ball FighterZ was a standout, amazing fighting game. It's also with incredible churn that only approached 9,000, but it got really close to it. And as a developer, you need to, I think, stop thinking about your game as being the next great showcase at EVO. Because if that's your only goal, you're going to end up with a game that has a very, very, very hardcore minority of fans. But that is not how you're going to sustain a studio for the next 3, 5, 10 years. Because if you think those hardcore fans are going to buy brand new single player content, or be interested in characters that break the design, they're not. And here's the other point. Even if you do try to release those characters, they may just ban them at tournaments. And a banned character at the competitive or tournament level may not even be worth it to exist in your game, because they're not going to play it, and they're not going to be interested in it. So, what do you think about the esports angle? And for anyone who's been like a long time watcher, player, or just kind of exposing yourself to the esports scene, how or has it changed from when you first started looking at it to where it is today? And do you think there is a way to kind of merge these two together? Can you make a game that has a very strong esports market and following and still grow it with interesting content that keeps core and casual players playing and also makes it appealing to new players? Because that is the final nail for this discussion. What always happens with every esport game under the sun is that once they plateau, they are not going to be growing anymore. They will not get that influx of new fans or new consumers, no matter how many new characters, new updates, collab events, special chapters, FOMO, battle passes, loot box, gacha, any other Pavlovian triggers that I can put into things. But with that said, everyone, just one final point to end things on. And that is, if Batman is somehow watching this video and needs to hire a gamer for some kind of gamer-related case, he can certainly call me. Unless it involves stealth, sports, or driving. Then he may need to call someone else. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you enjoyed the video, do the YouTubing stuff, be sure to visit our Discord and Patreon, and you're interested in more in my thoughts on design, check out my game design books.